The amber liquid in the curved glass bottle became a symbol of American imperialism in the eyes of Japanese military intelligence long before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor. What Japanese soldiers could never anticipate was how their discovery of Coca-Cola stockpiles in captured American bases across the Pacific would create a psychological turning point in their understanding of the enemy they faced. The distinctive contoured bottle, a design patented in 1915 that would become one of the most recognized objects on the planet, represented something far beyond a mere beverage. For Japanese troops who had been told Americans were soft, decadent, and unable to withstand hardship, finding industrial quantities of this civilian comfort drink at the front lines contradicted everything they had been taught about their enemy's resolve. The shock of this discovery would ripple through the Imperial Japanese forces in ways their commanders never anticipated, fundamentally altering their psychological assessment of the American war machine. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. To understand the profound psychological impact of Japanese soldiers discovering Coca-Cola at American bases, we must first journey back to the America of 1941, where a soft drink company was about to become an unexpected weapon in the greatest conflict humanity had ever known. When the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, few could have predicted that a caramel-colored carbonated beverage would become one of the most potent symbols of American presence in the Pacific theater. Yet the story of Coca-Cola during World War II represents one of the most remarkable intersections of corporate strategy, military logistics, and cultural symbolism in modern warfare. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, as America mobilized for war, Coca-Cola Company President Robert Woodruff made an unprecedented decision that would alter the trajectory of both his company and American soft power. See that every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents, wherever he is and whatever it costs our company, Woodruff declared in 1941, the seemingly simple corporate decision to make Coca-Cola available to every American serviceman at a fixed price, regardless of location, would require a logistical operation nearly as complex as military deployments themselves. The implications of Woodruff's directive were staggering. Coca-Cola would need to follow American troops to the farthest reaches of the globe, including the remote islands and atolls of the Pacific, where fierce battles against Imperial Japanese forces would rage for years. What began as a morale-boosting initiative quickly evolved into something far more significant in the eyes of military leadership. A taste of home that maintained the fighting spirit of American troops in brutal tropical conditions where combat stress, disease, and environmental hardships tested human endurance to its limits. By early 1942, as American forces established their first tenuous footholds in the Pacific Campaign, the Coca-Cola Company had already begun the remarkable process of building bottling plants that would follow the troops. Between 1943 and 1945, the company would construct 64 bottling plants around the world, with many appearing in Pacific locations like New Guinea, the Philippines, and eventually Okinawa. Military officials provided transportation priority for Coca-Cola equipment and ingredients, recognizing the beverage's importance to troop morale. The company created a special division of technical observers, Coca-Cola engineers and maintenance specialists who wore military uniforms with a unique TO designation and held officer rank, despite being company employees. These technical observers became legendary figures in the Pacific theater. They faced many of the same dangers as combat troops while maintaining their bottling operations, often within range of enemy fire. Their mission was singular: ensure that cold Coca-Cola remained available to American fighting men regardless of how remote or dangerous their location might be. In some forward operating areas, These TOs would arrive with portable bottling equipment almost immediately after combat operations concluded, sometimes even before medical supplies and ammunition had been fully unloaded. For American GIs sweating in the oppressive heat and humidity of Pacific Islands, the distinctive sound of a Coca-Cola bottle being opened became a powerful psychological anchor, a momentary reconnection to civilian life and American identity. Military commanders noted how this simple pleasure boosted morale in ways that formal recreation programs could not achieve. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, understanding this phenomenon from the European theater, had written to Coca-Cola requesting 10 bottling plants to support operations there. In the Pacific, similar requests came from commanders who recognized the beverage's outsized impact on fighting spirit. What American strategists couldn't fully anticipate was how this massive deployment of a civilian beverage would be interpreted by their Japanese adversaries. The Imperial Japanese Army, operating under fundamentally different cultural assumptions and severe logistical constraints, had no equivalent comfort for their troops. Japanese soldiers were expected to endure hardship stoically, subsisting on minimal rations and finding strength in spiritual discipline rather than material comforts. The discovery of Coca-Cola's ubiquitous presence at American installations would create a profound cognitive dissonance for Japanese troops who captured American positions or recovered artifacts from battlefields. The first documented instances of Japanese soldiers encountering Coca-Cola occurred in the Philippines during the early Japanese victories of 1942 as Imperial forces overran American positions at Bataan and Corregidor. They discovered significant stockpiles of the beverage among American supplies. Initial Japanese military intelligence reports categorized these findings as evidence of American decadence and poor military discipline, precisely the stereotypes that Japanese propaganda had promoted about their enemy. Yet, as the war progressed and similar discoveries continued across different islands and battlefields, a more complex understanding began to emerge among Japanese officers. By mid-1943, recovered Japanese military diaries and intelligence assessments revealed a shifting perception. Far from seeing Coca-Cola as merely a symbol of American weakness, some Japanese officers began to recognize it as evidence of America's staggering industrial and logistical capabilities. How could a nation that could deliver something as non-essential as soda to remote Pacific islands not be formidable in its ability to supply weapons, ammunition, and essential military equipment? This realization proved psychologically significant for Japanese forces already beginning to experience the constraints of their own overstretched supply lines. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Navy, whose diary was recovered after the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, wrote, "The Americans appear to drink this sweet black water even in battle. We find their bottles everywhere, even in the most forward positions. It seems they consider it as essential as ammunition. Perhaps there is something in this liquid that gives them their fighting spirit. Our men are fascinated by the bottles and have begun collecting the strange writing on them." The strange writing Lieutenant Tanaka referenced was the Coca-Cola logo written in its distinctive Spencerian script, a thoroughly American aesthetic that would have appeared exotic and foreign to Japanese soldiers. Some recovered Japanese military effects included Coca-Cola bottles or caps kept as souvenirs, suggesting a fascination with this ubiquitous symbol of American culture. Military intelligence officers from both sides noted this phenomenon, with American reports indicating surprise at finding their discarded Coca-Cola bottles carefully preserved in Japanese military positions. For Japanese soldiers indoctrinated with the belief that Americans were soft and unable to withstand hardship, the paradox became increasingly apparent. How could an enemy so seemingly dependent on comforts like cold soda simultaneously demonstrate such fierce fighting capability and logistical superiority? This cognitive dissonance created what military psychologists would later identify as a significant morale factor in the Pacific Campaign. By 1944, as the strategic initiative in the Pacific had fully shifted to American forces, the psychological impact of America's industrial and logistical might was becoming increasingly apparent to Japanese leadership. intercepted communications and interrogations of Japanese prisoners revealed growing concern about America's seemingly limitless supply capabilities. A Japanese officer captured in the Marianas in June 1944 reportedly told interrogators, "When we found they could bring their special drink to such places, we knew we could not match their supply strength. It made many of our soldiers question what we had been told about American fighting spirit." The presence of Coca-Cola throughout the Pacific Theater represented something far more significant than corporate marketing. It became a visceral demonstration of America's industrial capacity and logistical capabilities, an inadvertent psychological operation that undermined Japanese confidence while boosting American morale. Each bottle served as tangible evidence that the American war machine could deliver not just necessities, but comforts to its fighting forces across vast oceanic distances, a capability the Japanese military could not hope to match as the war progressed. The story of Coca-Cola in the Pacific isn't merely about a beverage company supporting the war effort. It represents a profound intersection of corporate enterprise with military strategy and the projection of cultural power. The Coca-Cola technical observers who followed American forces from island to island were not just maintaining a supply of refreshments, they were agents of what would later be recognized as a powerful form of cultural diplomacy. Their work ensured that wherever American forces established a presence, one of America's most recognizable commercial symbols would follow. This cultural projection extended beyond American troops to local civilian populations across the Pacific. As islands were secured from Japanese control, local residents often had their first encounter with American culture through Coca-Cola. Children in recently liberated Philippine villages or indigenous populations on Pacific islands who had never seen Americans before the war quickly became familiar with the distinctive bottle and logo. American military photographers captured numerous images of GIs sharing Coca-Cola with local children, images that would later be recognized as powerful artifacts of America's self-perception as a benevolent, liberating force. For Japanese intelligence officers attempting to understand their adversary, these interactions between American troops and local populations, mediated through something as seemingly trivial as a soft drink, represented a troubling dimension of American power. Japanese occupation policies typically maintained strict separation between occupying forces and local populations, with severe punishment for fraternization. The casual American willingness to share their beverages and other comforts with civilians created a stark contrast in occupation styles that further complicated Japanese efforts to maintain anti-American sentiment among occupied populations. The Coca-Cola bottling operations in the Pacific Theater also revealed a distinctly American approach to warfare, one that blended military necessity with commercial enterprise in ways that were foreign to Japanese military thinking. The Japanese military operated under a strict ethos of austerity and sacrifice, where personal comfort was subordinated entirely to the needs of the emperor and the nation. The American approach, which recognized morale and comfort as essential components of fighting effectiveness, represented a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare that Japanese military leadership struggled to fully comprehend. By early 1945, as American forces advanced inexorably toward the Japanese home islands, the Coca-Cola supply chain had developed into a remarkably sophisticated operation. Syrup concentrate was shipped from the United States to bottling plants established on secure islands, where it was combined with purified local water, carbonated, and bottled for distribution to troops. Specialized refrigeration equipment, often powered by generators that ran on the same fuel as military vehicles, ensured that even in the oppressive tropical heat, American servicemen could enjoy their Coca-Cola cold. This level of logistical complexity for a non-essential item was unprecedented in military history and demonstrated America's unique blend of commercial and military capabilities. Japanese military observers, who had been trained to expect an enemy weakened by dependence on luxury and comfort, instead found an adversary whose industrial and logistical superiority allowed them to maintain these comforts without compromising fighting effectiveness. This realization contributed to a gradual but significant shift in how Japanese leadership assessed their strategic position as the war progressed. The psychological impact cannot be overstated for Japanese forces increasingly facing shortages of basic military necessities like ammunition and medical supplies. The ubiquitous presence of American Coca-Cola became a powerful symbol of the asymmetric nature of the conflict. The most dramatic encounters between Japanese soldiers and Coca-Cola occurred during the island hopping campaign of 1944-1945, when American forces would establish beachheads and push inland, sometimes leaving behind supply caches that were later discovered by Japanese defenders attempting counterattacks. A particularly notable incident occurred during the Battle of Peleliu in September 1944, where a Japanese night infiltration unit encountered an American supply depot containing several cases of Coca-Cola. Survivor accounts from both sides describe Japanese soldiers' fascination with the bottles, with some stopping to examine or taste the unfamiliar beverage even as combat operations continued nearby, a momentary human curiosity amid the brutality of one of the Pacific Theater's most savage battles. American Marines who recaptured the position the following morning found empty. Coca-Cola bottles arranged in careful rows, an impromptu display suggesting the Japanese soldiers had methodically sampled the beverage before continuing their mission. Marine Corps intelligence officers noted this unusual behavior in their reports, speculating about its psychological significance. One report suggested, "Enemy appears fascinated by our supply of Coca-Cola." Recovered position shows evidence they consumed several bottles. Possible morale impact on enemy who observe our abundant supply. Capabilities, even for non-essential items. This assessment touched on a crucial psychological dimension of the Pacific War. For Japanese forces increasingly subjected to supply shortages as American submarines decimated their merchant shipping. The contrast between their material conditions and the apparent American abundance became increasingly demoralizing. A Japanese soldier subsisting on increasingly meager rice rations who discovered American troops had access to bottled soft drinks was confronted with undeniable evidence of the material disparity between the opposing forces, a disparity that Japanese propaganda could not effectively counter as the war progressed. By the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, the last major engagement before the planned invasion of Japan's home islands, the Coca-Cola supply operation had reached its peak efficiency. Within weeks of securing areas of the island, a fully operational bottling plant had been established to serve American forces. Japanese defenders who had been told they were fighting to protect their homeland from barbaric invaders instead found an enemy who brought with them not just weapons, but a fully functioning segment of their civilian economy, complete with the manufacturing capacity to produce soft drinks within a combat zone. For the Japanese soldiers who had been indoctrinated with images of Americans as decadent but weak adversaries, the cognitive dissonance was profound. The enemy they had been taught to despise for its materialism and comfort-seeking had somehow leveraged those very traits into overwhelming logistical and industrial advantages. More troublingly for Japanese military psychology, American fighting effectiveness seemed undiminished by these comforts. If anything, American troops appeared to fight more effectively with their morale bolstered by touches of home, like Coca-Cola. As the war in the Pacific reached its final and most destructive phase in the summer of 1945, the psychological impact of America's industrial and logistical superiority, symbolized in part by the ubiquitous presence of Coca-Cola, had thoroughly permeated Japanese military thinking. Intelligence assessments prepared for Imperial Japanese headquarters increasingly acknowledged the impossibility of matching American material capabilities. A military that could deliver glass bottles of carbonated beverages to combat zones could certainly deliver whatever weapons and supplies its strategy required. For Japanese leadership contemplating the defense of their home islands against the anticipated American invasion, this realization contributed to a growing sense of inevitable defeat that would ultimately influence the decision to surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The final irony of the Coca-Cola story in the Pacific War would come during the American occupation of Japan after the surrender. Within months of establishing the occupation government under General Douglas MacArthur, Coca-Cola bottling operations were established in Japan itself. Japanese civilians, many suffering from severe shortages of basic necessities in the war's aftermath, watched as occupation forces enjoyed not just adequate food and supplies, but luxuries like Coca-Cola. Rather than creating resentment, however, this display of American abundance generated fascination. When Coca-Cola became available to Japanese consumers in 1949, it sparked an enthusiastic reception that would have been unimaginable just years earlier when Japanese propaganda denounced the beverage as a symbol of Western decadence. For Japanese soldiers who had encountered Coca-Cola during the war and survived to see the American occupation, the beverage's rapid acceptance in post-war Japanese society symbolized the profound psychological and cultural transformation their nation was undergoing. The drink they had once regarded with mixture of curiosity and disdain as an emblem of American excess had become a coveted symbol of modernization and connection to the emerging global consumer culture. This transformation mirrored Japan's larger post-war realignment as former enemies became economic partners and eventually allies. The full extent of Coca-Cola's wartime operations remained classified for several years after the conflict ended. When finally revealed through declassified military records and company archives, the scale of the operation astonished contemporary observers. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola had been provided to American troops worldwide, with a significant portion consumed in the Pacific Theater. The company had deployed 248 technical observers globally, with 64 of them serving in the Pacific. These civilian employees, operating under military authority, had constructed and maintained bottling operations that followed American forces from Australia to Okinawa. Military historians analyzing the Pacific War in subsequent decades identified the Coca-Cola supply chain as one of the most effective morale operations of the conflict. A 1949 Army study concluded the psychological value of providing familiar comforts to combat troops cannot be overstated. The Coca-Cola program demonstrated that maintaining connections to civilian life enhanced rather than diminished fighting effectiveness. The unexpected secondary effect, the psychological impact on enemy forces who discovered evidence of our material. Abundance represents an unplanned but significant component of our psychological warfare advantage. For Japanese veterans who had encountered American Coca-Cola during the war, the memory remained vivid decades later. Interviews conducted with former Japanese soldiers in the 1970s and 1980s frequently mentioned the discovery of Coca-Cola among their recollections of encountering American forces. One former Imperial Army sergeant interviewed in 1978 recalled, "We had been told Americans were soft and undisciplined, but when we saw they could bring their civilian drinks to islands where we could barely get military supplies, many of us began to question what we had been told. If they could bring such things, what else could they bring? It was then I first began to doubt we could win." This sergeant's reflection captures the essence of Coca-Cola's unexpected role in the psychological dimension of the Pacific War beyond its intended purpose as a morale booster for American troops. The beverage became an inadvertent but powerful symbol of American industrial might and logistical capability. For Japanese soldiers increasingly facing the reality of their nation's material disadvantage as the war progressed, each discovered Coca-Cola bottle represented tangible evidence of an enemy whose resources seemed limitless compared to their own increasingly desperate circumstances. As dawn broke over the tiny island of Peleliu on October 15, 1944, a Japanese reconnaissance unit emerged from their cave hideout to assess the American positions that had pushed inland over the previous month of brutal fighting. What they discovered would shake their understanding of the enemy they faced and the nature of the war itself. In a clearing barely secured by American forces, a technical observer from Coca-Cola had established a rudimentary distribution point. Despite ongoing combat mere hundreds of yards away, American Marines were receiving rationed bottles of cold Coca-Cola alongside their ammunition and rations. A Japanese officer observing the scene through binoculars reportedly lowered his glasses in disbelief, turning to his subordinate to ask, "How can we fight an enemy who has such resources to spare? They bring their luxury drinks to the battlefield, while we have not seen rice in 3 days." This profound disparity in supply capabilities was not lost on the Japanese military leadership, who received increasingly concerning reports from field commanders throughout 1944 and 1945. A confidential Imperial Headquarters assessment from February 1945, captured during the battle for Iwo Jima, revealed the psychological impact of America's logistical superiority. Enemy forces maintain supply chains for non-essential comfort items that exceed our capacity to deliver basic military necessities. This fact has not escaped the attention of our forward units and creates significant challenges for maintaining fighting spirit. The contrast between our circumstances and the enemy's apparent abundance has become a matter of concern for unity. Cohesion, the psychological effect, was particularly acute for Japanese forces, who had been isolated on bypassed islands. A common fate as the American island-hopping strategy left numerous Japanese garrisons cut off from supply and communication. On islands like Rabaul, Truk, and Wewak, Japanese troops remained stranded for years as the main thrust of the war moved elsewhere. When these isolated units occasionally captured American supply drops or conducted raids on forward positions, they invariably discovered Coca-Cola among the American provisions. For troops subsisting on increasingly desperate forage diets and suffering from malnutrition and tropical diseases, these discoveries reinforced their abandonment while emphasizing their enemy's continuing material abundance. Captain Masao Hirano, a Japanese officer stranded on Truk Atoll from 1944 until the war's end, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We intercepted an American airdrop in late 1944 and found packages containing not just rations, but cigarettes, medical supplies, and several dozen bottles of their cola beverage. My men had not tasted sugar in months. Some wept at seeing such plenty still flowing to American troops, while we had been forgotten by our own supply chain. It was then I first recognized that Japan could not match this level of material support and that our defeat was inevitable, though I could not express such thoughts to my men." The contrast in attitudes toward creature comforts represented a fundamental philosophical difference between the Japanese and American approaches to warfare. Japanese military tradition emphasized spiritual strength, seishin, over material comfort, with soldiers expected to demonstrate their fighting spirit through endurance of hardship and willingness to sacrifice physical comfort for the emperor and nation. This tradition had deep roots in samurai culture and Bushido principles that viewed excessive concern with physical comfort as a sign of moral and spiritual weakness. American military thinking, while certainly valuing discipline and sacrifice, recognized the practical value of maintaining troop morale through reasonable comforts when logistically possible. This pragmatic approach reflected broader American cultural values emphasizing quality of life and the belief that material well-being enhanced rather than diminished fighting effectiveness. The ability to deliver Coca-Cola to combat zones wasn't merely about refreshment. It demonstrated America's commitment to maintaining the morale and psychological well-being of its fighting forces even under the most challenging conditions. This philosophical difference created a significant psychological vulnerability for Japanese forces as the war progressed. Having been indoctrinated with the belief that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage, Japanese soldiers who directly observed America's logistical capabilities, symbolized by but certainly not limited to Coca-Cola, faced a profound challenge to their worldview. If American troops could maintain both their material comforts and their fighting effectiveness, then a core assumption of Japanese military psychology was invalidated. This realization contributed to the gradual erosion of Japanese fighting spirit that military historians have identified in the war's later stages. The Coca-Cola supply chain itself represented a remarkable achievement in wartime logistics. The technical observers who established and maintained bottling operations in the Pacific faced extraordinary challenges. Equipment and ingredients had to be transported thousands of miles across submarine-infested waters. Bottling plants required stable water supplies, reliable electricity, and refrigeration capacity, all scarce commodities in the Pacific Islands. Yet by 1944, the operation had become so efficient that a Marine landing on a newly secured beachhead could reasonably expect to receive a cold Coca-Cola within days of the initial assault, sometimes even before mail from home arrived. This logistical miracle did not go unnoticed by Japanese intelligence analysts. Captured documents from Japanese military headquarters reveal increasing concern about what the Coca-Cola supply chain represented in terms of broader American capabilities. A Japanese naval intelligence assessment from November 1944 noted, American forces appeared to maintain parallel supply chains for military necessities and civilian comforts. Their ability to deliver non-essential beverages to forward combat areas suggests a logistical capacity that exceeds our current estimates. This requires reassessment of their probable supply capabilities for essential military equipment and may indicate greater offensive potential than previously calculated. The Coca-Cola supply operation also created unexpected cross-cultural encounters throughout the Pacific. Technical observers frequently employed local labor at bottling plants established in secured areas, creating one of the first points of economic contact between American forces and indigenous populations. On islands like New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the Philippines, local workers at Coca-Cola facilities often received their first exposure to American industrial methods, corporate practices, and workplace culture. These interactions, while primarily focused on the practical task of producing beverages for American troops, created relationships that would later facilitate broader economic ties during post-war reconstruction. For Japanese military governance in occupied territories, these economic interactions represented a troubling counterpoint to their own occupation policies. Japanese forces typically extracted resources from occupied areas through coercion and forced labor, creating resentment among local populations. The contrast between this approach and the American willingness to establish economic partnerships, even for something as seemingly trivial as soft drink production, contributed to the erosion of Japanese influence among indigenous populations across the Pacific. Local leaders who observed both occupation styles increasingly viewed American forces as the preferable alternative, further undermining Japanese strategic position as the war progressed. The psychological significance of Coca-Cola extended beyond its impact on Japanese forces to influence America's own understanding of its wartime role. For American troops, the familiar bottle represented not just a taste of home, but a tangible reminder of what they were fighting to protect, a way of life built on abundance, consumer choice, and material comfort. This symbolic dimension was not lost on military leadership or the company itself. Advertisements in American magazines frequently featured servicemen enjoying Coca-Cola, with taglines emphasizing how the familiar beverage connected the home front to the war effort. This marketing narrative that Coca-Cola represented a thread of continuity between civilian and military life proved remarkably effective in solidifying the beverage's cultural significance. For American families with sons, brothers, and fathers serving in the Pacific, the knowledge that their loved ones could still enjoy this familiar comfort provided emotional reassurance. The psychological value of this connection extended beyond individual families to shape broader American cultural narratives about the war, narratives that emphasized America's ability to project not just military power, but its very way of life to the farthest reaches of the globe. For Japanese civilians who had been told by their government that Americans were barbaric invaders intent on destroying Japanese culture, the actual behavior of occupation forces after the surrender presented a confounding counter-narrative. The same troops who had fought so fiercely against Japanese forces now shared their Coca-Cola with Japanese children, established orderly civic administration, and introduced consumer goods previously unavailable under wartime restrictions. This cognitive dissonance accelerated the psychological reorientation of Japanese society toward acceptance of defeat and openness to American influence during the occupation period. The technical observers themselves occupied a unique position in the military hierarchy and in the historical narrative of the Pacific War. Neither fully civilian nor truly military, these Coca-Cola employees in uniform represented a distinctly American innovation, the integration of corporate expertise into military operations. Their specialized knowledge of bottling operations, water purification, refrigeration, and carbonation technologies made them valuable assets beyond their primary role of producing beverages. Technical observers frequently assisted military engineers with water purification for medical facilities, maintenance of refrigeration for blood plasma storage, and other technical challenges that benefited from their industrial expertise. This blending of corporate and military functions foreshadowed the military-industrial relationships that would become central to American strategic thinking during the Cold War. The Technical Observer Program demonstrated how civilian industrial expertise could be effectively integrated into military operations while maintaining corporate identity and specialized knowledge. For Japanese military thinkers accustomed to strict separation between military and civilian spheres, this flexible American approach to leveraging corporate capabilities for military advantage represented yet another dimension of American power that Japan could not effectively counter. Perhaps the most profound psychological impact of Coca-Cola's Pacific War story emerged not during the conflict, but in its aftermath. As Japan rebuilt under American occupation and later as an independent ally, Coca-Cola became one of the most visible symbols of Japan's integration into the American-led global economic order. The beverage that Japanese soldiers had once viewed with curiosity and concern as a symbol of their enemy's material abundance became a coveted consumer product in post-war Japanese society. This transformation mirrored Japan's larger psychological journey from military adversary to economic partner. When Coca-Cola officially entered the Japanese consumer market in 1949, it was embraced with an enthusiasm that would have been unimaginable just years earlier. The beverage that had once symbolized the enemy's decadence now represented access to international consumer culture and Japan's reintegration into global commerce. For Japanese veterans who had encountered Coca-Cola under combat conditions, this rapid acceptance of an American product represented the final psychological chapter of their wartime experience, a tangible symbol of how completely their nation's relationship with America had been transformed. The battle for Saipan in June-July 1944 provided one of the most significant documented instances of Japanese forces encountering Coca-Cola under combat conditions. As American Marines secured portions of the island, technical observers established a distribution point using portable refrigeration equipment near the beachhead. Japanese counterattacks in early July briefly penetrated American lines, with one-night infiltration unit discovering the Coca-Cola station. Marine reports following the recapture of the position noted that the Japanese soldiers had apparently stopped to examine and consume some of the beverages before continuing their attack. A Marine intelligence officer interviewing Japanese prisoners captured during the engagement recorded this remarkable exchange. When questioned about their unit's objectives during the night attack, the senior NCO unexpectedly mentioned the American Special Drink Station they had encountered. He expressed surprise that such facilities would be established in an active combat zone and asked if the dark beverage had medicinal properties that enhanced American fighting abilities. When informed it was merely a popular civilian soft drink, he appeared skeptical, suggesting his unit believed it might be a form of combat stimulant explaining American endurance in tropical conditions. This misunderstanding that Coca-Cola might be a performance-enhancing combat stimulant rather than a civilian beverage, appeared with surprising frequency in Japanese intelligence assessments throughout the Pacific Campaign. Having no cultural context for understanding why a carbonated soft drink would receive such logistical priority in a war zone, some Japanese military analysts genuinely suspected the beverage must serve some functional military purpose beyond simple refreshment. This misinterpretation highlights the cultural and psychological gulf separating the two forces, a gulf that extended beyond military doctrine to encompass fundamentally different understandings of the relationship between material comfort and fighting effectiveness. As American forces advanced toward the Japanese home islands in 1945, the Coca-Cola operation expanded accordingly. When Okinawa was secured after the brutal fighting of April to June 1945, a full-scale bottling plant was established within weeks of the island being declared secure. This facility, positioned closer to the Japanese mainland than any previous Coca-Cola operation, would have supplied American forces during the planned invasion of Japan itself, had the atomic bombings and subsequent surrender not made such an invasion unnecessary. For the American occupation forces who entered Japan after the surrender in August 1945, Coca-Cola represented a taste of home in what was initially perceived as hostile territory. Within months, Coca-Cola technical observers were in Japan itself, establishing bottling operations to serve occupation troops. These facilities became unexpected cultural contact points between American personnel and Japanese civilians, many of whom gained their first employment in the post-war economy working in Coca-Cola distribution and eventually in Japanese-owned bottling franchises as restrictions on Japanese business ownership were gradually lifted during the occupation. The story of how Japanese soldiers reacted to finding Coca-Cola at American bases in the Pacific represents more than a curious historical anecdote. It illuminates the psychological dimension of the Pacific War, how material disparities shaped perceptions and morale on both sides, how cultural differences influenced military effectiveness, and how corporate enterprise became intertwined with national power projection in ways that would define the post-war global order. For the United States, the Coca-Cola operation demonstrated the country's unique ability to project not just military force but its cultural and commercial identity to the furthest reaches of the globe. For Japan, encounters with this ubiquitous symbol of American consumer culture forced a reevaluation of pre-war assumptions about Western decadence and material weakness. In the psychological battle that paralleled the physical conflict across the Pacific, Coca-Cola became an unexpected but significant weapon in America's arsenal, one that would ultimately help shape not just the outcome of the war, but the nature of the peace that followed. The final irony of this story emerged in the decades after the war, as Coca-Cola became one of the most successful American consumer products in the Japanese market. By the 1970s, Japan had become one of Coca-Cola's largest overseas markets, with per capita consumption rates approaching American levels. The beverage that Japanese soldiers had once viewed with suspicion and fascination had become thoroughly integrated into Japanese consumer culture. This transformation symbolized the broader success of American soft power in post-war Japan, the ability to convert a former enemy into not just a political ally but a cultural and economic partner. For the dwindling number of Japanese veterans who had encountered Coca-Cola under combat conditions, watching their grandchildren casually consuming the beverage in peaceful, prosperous Japan provided a poignant reminder of how completely their world had changed. The American special drink that had once symbolized the enemy's material superiority had become an unremarkable part of daily Japanese life, its wartime significance fading into history as new generations embraced a globalized consumer culture with no memory of the Pacific conflict. The legacy of Coca-Cola's wartime operations extended far beyond the beverage itself. The Technical Observer Program established a template for military-corporate cooperation that would influence American strategic thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. The company's ability to rapidly deploy industrial capabilities to support military operations demonstrated the flexibility and responsiveness of American capitalism, qualities that would prove crucial to American strategic advantages in subsequent decades. For military historians, the Coca-Cola story provides a valuable case study in the often overlooked psychological dimension of warfare. Beyond the tangible factors of weapons, troop numbers, and tactical decisions, wars are ultimately decided by human psychology, the will to continue fighting in the face of hardship and uncertainty. By maintaining a tangible connection to civilian life and American identity through something as seemingly trivial as a soft drink, American military leadership recognized and addressed this psychological dimension in ways that their Japanese counterparts failed to fully appreciate until too late. The technical achievements of the Coca-Cola war operation remain impressive even by modern standards. Between 1942 and 1945, the company shipped more than 150,000 pounds of materials specifically for constructing bottling plants throughout the Pacific Theater. Specialized equipment was designed to function in tropical conditions, with portable refrigeration units capable of operating on multiple power sources, including generators, vehicle engines, and even modified aircraft auxiliary power units. Water purification systems developed for Coca-Cola production were later adapted for broader military and humanitarian applications, while carbonation technologies advanced significantly through the challenges of operating in remote Pacific locations. This technical legacy extended into the post-war period as innovations developed for wartime Coca-Cola production found civilian applications during the economic boom of the 1950s and 1960s. Compact refrigeration systems, lightweight glass bottles designed for efficient shipping, and advanced water purification techniques all emerged from the crucible of wartime necessity. The Coca-Cola technical observers, who had maintained these systems under combat conditions, returned to civilian life with expertise that would help drive America's post-war consumer revolution. On Guadalcanal in August 1942, during one of the Pacific War's earliest and most desperate battles, a Japanese night patrol stumbled upon an abandoned American position containing several warm bottles of Coca-Cola. As recounted by Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto in a 1985 interview, "We had not eaten properly in days. Finding these strange American bottles was like discovering artifacts from another world. Some men thought it might be medicine or alcohol. When one soldier tasted it and declared it was sweet, several fought over the remaining bottles. I remember thinking, if they can bring such things to this island hell, what chance do we have against such abundance?" This encounter occurred during the tenuous early phase of the Guadalcanal campaign, when American forces were themselves struggling with supply shortages. That even under these adverse conditions Coca-Cola had reached the front lines made a profound impression on the Japanese patrol. For soldiers who had been told they were fighting an effete, materialistic society incapable of real sacrifice, the discovery complicated their understanding of their adversary. If Americans could maintain such seemingly frivolous comforts, even while fighting for survival on a remote jungle island, perhaps they possessed greater resolve than Japanese propaganda had suggested. As the tide of war shifted decisively against Japan in 1944 and 1945, the psychological impact of America's material superiority became increasingly significant. Japanese forces, who had initially believed in their spiritual advantage through willingness to endure hardship, found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to suffer no penalty for maintaining creature comforts. The assumed trade-off between material well-being and fighting spirit, central to Japanese military psychology, proved false in practice. Americans, with their Coca-Cola, cigarettes, and relatively abundant rations, demonstrated combat effectiveness equal or superior to Japanese units priding themselves on austere self-denial. For Japanese military leadership contemplating the defense of their home islands against the anticipated American invasion, this realization contributed to a growing sense of inevitable defeat. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, who would later serve in the surrender cabinet, reportedly remarked to colleagues in July 1945, "If they can deliver glass bottles of sweet water to Okinawa while we cannot deliver rice to our own troops, how can we possibly repel them from our shores?" Their material advantage has become spiritual advantage as our forces lose confidence. While the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would ultimately prove decisive in forcing Japan's surrender, the psychological impact of America's conventional material superiority had already created conditions where Japanese military leadership increasingly recognized the futility of continued resistance. The ubiquitous presence of Coca-Cola throughout the Pacific Campaign served as a constant, tangible reminder of this material disparity, one that Japanese forces encountered directly through combat operations and could not dismiss as mere propaganda. The relationship between Coca-Cola and the American military did not end with World War II. The networks established during the conflict formed the foundation for the company's global expansion during the Cold War, with American military bases around the world serving as beachheads for introducing the product to new markets. From South Korea to West Germany, the pattern established in the Pacific War, Coca-Cola, following American military presence, continued to shape both corporate strategy and American cultural influence globally. This commercial-military relationship represented a uniquely American approach to global power projection, one that blended hard military power with commercial enterprise and cultural influence in ways that competitors like the Soviet Union struggled to match. The soft power generated through this approach would prove crucial to American strategic advantages throughout the Cold War, particularly in regions like Japan, where former adversaries became crucial allies against communist expansion in Asia. For the generation of Japanese who lived through the war and occupation, Coca-Cola became one of the most visible symbols of their nation's defeated past and its American-influenced future. The beverage that Japanese soldiers had once examined with curiosity on Pacific battlefields became a fixture in Japanese urban life, its red and white logo appearing in the same Tokyo neighborhoods where wartime propaganda had once demonized all things American. This transformation embodied Japan's broader post-war journey from militarism to commercial, pacifism under American security guarantees, a profound national reinvention symbolized in part by the acceptance of American consumer culture. The final chapter of this story emerged in the 1980s and 1990s as Japan's economic miracle transformed the country into an export powerhouse and technological leader. Japanese companies that had learned American management and production techniques during the occupation era began competing successfully against their American counterparts in global markets. Among these competitive areas was the beverage industry itself, with Japanese companies like Suntory and Kirin developing sophisticated soft drink operations that competed directly with Coca-Cola, both in Japan and eventually in international markets. This economic competition represented the ultimate resolution of the Pacific War's psychological dimension. Former adversaries now engaged not in military conflict, but in market competition. Their relationship transformed from existential enemies to economic rivals operating within a shared framework of capitalist democracy. For the dwindling number of veterans who had experienced the Pacific War firsthand, this transformation must have seemed nearly as miraculous as the technological advances they witnessed throughout their long lives. The last documented Japanese veteran known to have encountered Coca-Cola under combat conditions was Lieutenant Hiru Onoda, who surrendered on Lubang Island in the Philippines in 1974, having continued to fight for 29 years after the war's official end, unaware or disbelieving that Japan had surrendered. When finally convinced to lay down his weapons by his former commanding officer, one of Onoda's first experiences of the post-war world was being offered a bottle of Coca-Cola by Philippine officials. According to witnesses, he examined the familiar bottle with recognition, noting that he had seen similar items in American positions during combat operations decades earlier. His quiet acceptance of the beverage symbolized his personal surrender, not just to the reality of Japan's defeat, but to the American-influenced world order that had emerged in his absence. This poignant moment encapsulated the entire arc of the Coca-Cola story in the Pacific War, from object of curiosity and symbol of enemy extravagance to accepted emblem of a shared consumer culture. What Japanese soldiers had once regarded as evidence of American decadence had become, through the crucible of conflict and reconstruction, a symbol of American-led prosperity and global connection. Few products in history have undergone such a complete transformation in cultural meaning within a single generation. The legacy of Coca-Cola's Pacific War operations continues to resonate in contemporary military thinking about morale and psychological operations. Modern American military deployment includes sophisticated support services designed to maintain troop morale through connections to civilian life and American cultural touchpoints. From internet access to fast food outlets at major bases, today's military planners acknowledge the psychological value of maintaining familiar comforts. Even in combat zones, a lesson learned in part through the success of the Coca-Cola program during World War II. For Japanese and American societies alike, the Coca-Cola story represents an instructive case study in how commercial products can transcend their utilitarian functions to become powerful cultural symbols. The journey of this American beverage from enemy, curiosity to accepted global product illuminates the broader transformation of Japanese-American relations from bitter enmity to close alliance, one of the most successful enemy-to-ally transitions in modern history. As the last veterans of the Pacific War pass from the scene, the first-hand memories of Japanese soldiers encountering Coca-Cola on remote Pacific battlefields fade into history. Yet the legacy of those encounters persists in the institutional memories of both nations and in the corporate history of one of the world's most recognized brands. The unexpected role of a carbonated beverage in the psychological dimension of humanity's greatest conflict reminds us that war is never fought solely with weapons and tactics. It is ultimately a contest of human perception, will, and belief. The story of Japanese soldiers discovering Coca-Cola at American bases represents more than a curious historical footnote. It illuminates the complex interplay of material resources, cultural values, and psychological factors that shape warfare beyond the immediate clash of arms. In the carbonated sweetness of a simple beverage, Japanese soldiers glimpsed the industrial might and logistical capabilities that would ultimately overcome their nation's martial spirit and imperial ambitions. What they could not have foreseen was how completely that same beverage would one day be embraced by their own society, a testament to the transformative power of peace after the devastation of war.